Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding and Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And my guest today is Dr. Sean Condon. He's a clinical psychologist and founder of the Flatiron Center for Psychotherapy, where he specializes in helping individuals navigate anxiety, relationship challenges, and major life transitions. Known for his warm, direct style and integrative therapeutic approach, he brings over 2 decades of experience guiding clients toward meaningful insight and lasting change. Welcome, Dr. Sean Condon. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
You know, one thing that I think is really interesting about your work is that you talk about therapy as being a space for growth, not just relief, symptom relief. And, I think a lot of people go to therapy because they're experiencing anxiety or depression or fear or sadness or dissatisfaction with life, a symptom, right? There's something that comes up and certainly divorce is one of those things. And so for our listeners, after a divorce, what does healing really look like in your view from that perspective?
Right. No, that's a great question, Catherine. And, I think for you and your listeners, I don't want to sugarcoat it either. I think that going through divorce, there are opportunities for healing and even for growth. But I don't want to make it sound like, oh, you should look at your divorce as an opportunity for growth. I think you and I know it's not so simple as that. The idea, though, for healing, for example, is that we all go through it a little bit in our own way. And that part of the process, actually part of the trick with healing, as you probably know, Catherine, is that the first step is really getting in touch with the pain first. And while that's not easy, right, and people can struggle with that, if they can get in touch with that pain and think about it and process that, either on their own or with the help of a good therapist, then that really opens the door for a kind of healing process, not just feeling better, but getting in touch with yourself in certain ways, seeing how you go through this process, seeing what gets in your way, seeing where you get stuck, getting some sense of the sensitivities and discomforts that are hardest for you to grapple with. And then by being able to grapple with those, again, sometimes with the help of a therapist, we can learn a lot about ourselves and approach some things even differently moving forward in our lives.
Sean Condon, a couple of things that come to mind when I hear you say that. For one thing, I can imagine somebody thinking, I don't want to get in touch with the pain. I'm already pretty in touch with it. It's not comfortable. I would really like to not be more in touch with the pain. So that's one thing. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is such a common experience. I suspect, actually, Catherine, that almost everyone feels a little bit that way when they're going through something like a divorce, right? And it would be kind of a natural feeling. The pain is difficult. It's difficult. But if you think about the 5 stages of grief that I imagine you've talked to other folks about and other therapists about, it can be one framework for understanding both the process of grief and the healing process post-divorce, right? If you think about those 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, really those first 4 stages are all about how we grapple with the reality of the loss and the feelings involved with it, how we try to come to terms with those things. And it's not easy, but by being able to grapple with those, right, and by ultimately being able to get to depression, or that is the sadness of loss, which we often think of first when we think of things like divorce, but doesn't always come first. There's many complicated reactions one can have. But if we can get to some of that sadness and experience the loss, that opens up the space for something like acceptance.
So from that perspective, can you define and talk a little bit about the therapeutic arc post-divorce in a way that feels more hopeful and more grounded for people who might feel really anxious and really in that painful spot right now?
Yes. I think as much as we've focused in the beginning of the conversation here on the pain, part of it, and that is definitely true. It's also true that, and I think you probably know this from your own work too, Catherine, that people do get through this and come through the other side. And having seen people go through this process, when I meet a new person, I'm in a position of having some more hope and optimism than they are because I've seen how this can go for people. And I've seen people starting out feeling so overwhelmed, so distraught, so hopeless about it, and yet being able to process some of these things and think about and reflect on some of how they go through it and really learn to move forward in their lives. So when I start with someone new, my part of my job is, I also, and related to this, I also kind of think this healing is a bit of a natural process, right? It is a natural process, but part of my job, like any good doctor, right? Let's say a doctor setting a bone to heal, right? I'm trying to create the optimal conditions, trying to promote this natural process, trying to promote the natural kind of psychological and emotional healing that you can go through. And so that's a little bit of how I think about my role in doing this. And I know that process, as much as the pain of divorce is powerful, that process is also powerful. And that we can do some things to help you kind of connect with that process and start to feel like you can do some of this.
Yeah, and just to connect this back, Sean Condon, to what we were talking about before, I actually think that divorce, like any challenge in life, whether or not it's something you choose or something you don't choose, is an opportunity for growth. And if you can shift that, you're thinking that, like, what is it that I can learn about myself? It's certainly the whole divorce process in my own personal experience, right? And I've observed so many clients that I've worked with over the years go through this. They are able to find a sort of sense of their own direction, their own authenticity, their own true values, what really matters to them and what doesn't, in the kind of kiln, right? Like in the fire of
Yeah.
that challenge. That can be actually a really quite beautiful thing in observing people go through that.
I think that's true. And I actually like how you described some of the ways I think that growth can happen, right? Really getting in touch with those things that are, and rethinking some of those things are more important to you than perhaps you realize. But I think one of the tricks that we're kind of confronting right now is it's much easier for someone to see that towards the end of the process than at the beginning. At the beginning, that's very difficult to see. And you and I, again, know that people can get there because we've seen that happen before. But when people are just starting out, right, they obviously need a lot of support and reassurance at first, and to help them with processing these very difficult things that they're in the middle of right now.
Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of people enter therapy when they're thinking about divorce or in the middle of divorce. And a lot of I think one of the reasons that people struggle to see that as a possible result is that they're feeling ashamed, they're feeling it's broken in some way. And so when you're working with someone, how do you help them shift that internal narrative to something that is maybe more constructive?
Yeah, yeah. No, a good question, and very common feelings: shame, guilt, feeling broken. You know, one of the things about shame, feeling ashamed or feeling broken, if I'm feeling bad about maybe some of the ways things played out with my partner or myself, or if I regret some of the things that happened over the course of our relationship, that's one thing. And maybe in some ways we need to be honest about some of that and process some of that over time. But shame, being ashamed or being broken, one of the things about those thoughts is they have a kind of irrevocable quality to me. They have a sense of permanence to them. I'm broken and that's it. I'm broken, I'm kind of broken for good. I'm ashamed. It's kind of a judgment in a way.
Sure.
I'm ashamed not just because I did something wrong, but because maybe I'm a bad person. And that's where a good therapist really wants to shift the thinking about that, because you might have done things that you regret, but none of this adds up to you're a bad person. None of this adds up to you're somehow psychologically broken or broken relationship wise or incapable of healthy relationships or things like that. And people's minds do go there because the experience of divorce can be profound and people do have genuine regrets. But it's those judgments, almost they're accused, tried, and convicted before they can even get started. processing this. And that's something that we want to push back on because that's not true. You're not broken in that way. You're not, you might be ashamed of what you did, but being ashamed of yourself as a person, that takes it way too far.
Yeah. Well, I think that the judgment has happened in the court of their own self perception, right? Not necessarily in the court of the way the world sees it.
That's
People,
right.
right? And people sit in my office all the time and tell me the things that they feel ashamed about, they feel guilty about, and they apologize, for having spent too much money, had an affair, whatever it is that they're talking about. And I'm not in the position of judging them. I mean, my gosh, some of the times the things that I've heard over the years, I mean, you wouldn't believe it, right? And so it feels like it's a matter of context. And so if you have a little broader view, that doesn't mean you have to blame the other person, but that these things happened and there's a reason that they happened.
Yes. No, I think that you're right. And I think you and I probably share some of this experience of hearing people talk about themselves in this way and feel they're so mired in the guilt and the self-blame. And it doesn't necessarily look that way to us. And part of the value of therapy for divorce and all sorts of other challenges, actually, but sticking with divorce is, as a therapist, I can see it through a more human lens in some ways. Unless you were abusive as a partner or outright exploitative or something like that, which does happen sometimes, but not 99% of the cases are not that. 99% of the cases are two people doing their best and it didn't work out. And sometimes maybe your emotions got the best of you and you said something that you regret. Sometimes you may have gotten caught up in your own conflicts or your own difficulties in certain ways. People lose sight of the fact that that's them being human beings. And it's not always easy. And so I think as a therapist and maybe even sometimes as an attorney, you can see that a little bit from the outside. And part of my job is to help people see themselves again in that light.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce-related topics so that everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Dr. Sean Condon. He's a clinical psychologist and founder of the Flatiron Center. And we're talking about divorce and the emotional elements of it and helping people through that and through the process of divorce recovery, if you will. And, one of the things, Sean Condon, that I'd like to talk about is personality patterns and how it impacts the couple's relationship and how it impacts what happens in the divorce and how, perfectionism, conflict avoidance, how can that impact somebody's experience of the divorce itself and their recovery?
Mm-hmm. Lots of different ways, actually. And because of personality patterns, among other things, people go through relationships and divorces all different sorts of ways. When it comes to personality patterns, there's different ways of thinking about it. One can think about personality traits, one can think about personality structure and dynamics. I actually kind of like to think about it as a style, a personality style or a character style, a way of being in the world, a way of experiencing myself and experiencing other people that then informs some of these things like relationships and divorce. And so, for example, conflict avoidance. If we think about that, I think that is something that would commonly be thought of as maybe a personality trait or pattern. But even that is not all the same. Some people might be conflict avoidant because they have, let's say, an anxious attachment style, and they're very worried about losing people that are close to them. Another person might be conflict avoidant because they're afraid of their own anger. They see their own anger as dangerous or toxic, not just how other people experience them, but how they experience them themselves when they're angry. So when it comes to therapy, right, there might be very different implications for those two different people. For someone who's got an anxious attachment style, you want to help them feel more comfortable. You want to demystify relationships. Maybe some even interpersonal skills or things like that could be relevant at some point, right? And some of those skills might be relevant in sorting through their divorce as well, helping them cope with the stresses of that. For someone, even things like helping them learn to speak up for themselves at times where their needs are very relevant, but they don't recognize that or can't speak directly to that. On the other hand, for someone who's afraid of their own anger, and kind of assertiveness training is likely to backfire. That's not going to work for them, at least not right off the bat. You have to help them get comfortable, more comfortable with their own experience of anger, be able to process it a bit themselves before they can get to the point of actually addressing conflict interpersonally more directly.
Yeah. And you know what? I think a lot of times in the training that we do at the Center for Understanding and Conflict, we have the participants take the Thomas Kilmann assessment. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's about conflict patterns between couples. So you have a person who is like a competitive person, and you have someone who's an avoider, say, right? And now you have a dynamic that can be really infuriating to both people. I mean, that's just one example. I call that the controller stonewaller, because to the person who is perceived by the controller, right, the competitor, as being stonewalling, they're controlling, not, and to the person who is the stonewaller is perceived by the controller as being impossible. They never get back to me about anything. And that, right, and these patterns between people, right, need to be interrupted in order for them to have a conversation that feels at all productive. And when we work with those people in mediation, one of the things that we're trying to do is to interrupt that. And I think it's useful for people to realize that what their own sort of patterns are. This doesn't define anybody. Like let me give you a personal example. In the early years of our marriage, I used to say to my husband, "What are you doing on Saturday?" And he'd say, "What do you want?" And I would think to myself, "What are you talking about? I'm just asking what you're doing on Saturday." But when I realized, and it really took some thinking about this, John Condon, that actually I did want to know what he was doing in the afternoon, because I had one kid going to a birthday party and another kid who had soccer practice, and I needed some help to kind of figure it out. So I really was looking for something, right? And
Right.
his sort of defensiveness was not coming from nowhere. And that is the kind of interest, even though I'm thinking, listen, I'm coming from a good place. This needs to happen, right? Anyway, I just wonder what your thoughts are about that in terms of the work that you do with divorcing people.
No, that's right. That's a great example, actually. And we all have those, examples, and it does come up all the time. And seeing those patterns, there was a time in my career where I did more couples therapy. I don't really do that anymore. But a lot of what a good couples therapist does, and it sounds like, Catherine, some of what you do when you're doing mediation, is to be in the room and to see those patterns and to not just point them out to the couple, but also to interrupt them, but to do them in a way where we can each kind of think about what we're bringing to this interaction. And one of the ways it's interesting that plays out, it seems to me, is one of the things that can come up in both relationships and divorces is people feeling like they've been kind of too much for their partner or they've been not enough for their partner. Those are ways that it can play out. And sometimes that happens, or our needs aren't perfectly matched. Sometimes someone really has greater needs than are being met in the relationship, or, right, wants more distance than their partner does. But the other thing is, those patterns tend to actually kind of take on a life of their own and then increase throughout the course of the relationship, so that the person who maybe has some greater needs, they're reaching out, their partner pulls back, then their needs get met less, then they reach out more, then their partner pulls back, then they reach out more, then their partner pulls back, right? So,
Yeah.
so me starting with needs, it ends up being amplified, and I end up feeling even needier in some ways and more desperate for what I'm looking for than I started out. And again, when you can interrupt some of those patterns with a good couples therapist, sometimes you can have couples reset. But sometimes we encounter people, post-divorce where that's played out. And then they're left with the kind of residual feelings of I was the needy person and I pushed my partner away. And the picture might be more complicated than that.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Subscribe to the podcast, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Dr. Sean Condon. He's a psychotherapist and the founder of the Flatiron Center for Psychotherapy. And Dr. Condon, if people are interested in learning more about you or your practice, how can they do that?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So one way is they can just reach out to my website, which is www.theflatironcenter, all one word, .com. They can see me and also the other psychologists I have on my team there. They can also reach out to me directly by email. That's Dr. Condon, DrCondon, at the Flatiron Center.
That's great. And I want to turn our attention to working with executives and high achievers. And I'm wondering what unique challenges you think, and in your perspective, from a psychotherapeutic perspective, that they challenge when they face a personal crisis like divorce.
Yeah, interesting question. I have had the opportunity in various ways to work with executives and CEOs and startup founders in the course of my career. And, you know, they do face some unique challenges, but one of the things I think is an important starting point is these folks, they're human beings like all the rest of us, and they struggle with things like divorce and the painful feelings involved, just like we do. We can be, I think, somewhat blinded by their, really notable success and ambition, and they tend to be quite high functioning people in many ways. But they struggle with these things too. And actually, one of the challenges with high functioning, high achieving people is that they have a lot of strengths, and also their work, when they're going through divorce, their work is such an important part of their identity and their value that they can in some ways retreat into that, actually. And in some ways that's a strength. It helps them kind of moderate or manage issues around self-esteem and identity and so on as they go through divorce. But in other ways, it can be actually one of the challenges can be that it can be hard to get them to slow down enough to pay attention to what they're actually going through, to allow them to make the space in their very busy, high-speed lives, but lives also with lots of responsibilities and lots of things to occupy their minds, to slow down enough to allow them to process some of the challenges related to divorce.
I have a question for you that I am wondering about your thoughts on, and that is that a lot of times when someone's work involves a lot of negotiation, and that person comes into a divorce, their spouse, their partner worries, well, my husband, my wife negotiates all the time for a living, so I'm at a disadvantage. And actually, I find that the people who do negotiate a lot in their work life come into the negotiations really wanting to compromise right away, and that they're actually not so great at negotiating in their own personal experiences. And I think any lawyer listening to this podcast would be like, yeah, I understand that. But so I'm wondering from a psychotherapeutic perspective, if that rings a bell for you, or what do you think might be going on for that? Or what could I say to clients who are worried about their spouse being such super negotiators?
That's an interesting question. And I've never seen that kind of negotiation play out. So I'm very curious actually about the kind of dynamic that you describe. But I can certainly imagine how it would be different in a personal context than in a business context. In a business context, I think these people who have these conversations all the time, they're so immersed and familiar with their business's own strategy and approach and what their priorities are and things like that, that they can balance listening to the other person, but also speaking very directly to some of those priorities. I think in our personal lives, things are messy and can be hard and can be confusing. And even if I'm a great negotiator, maybe in work and personal life, when it comes to something as deeply personal as divorce, that's bound to be challenging. That's bound to be challenging. So I don't know exactly how to reassure the person on the other end of that, but I think that part of managing divorce and part of even the negotiation around the details is the couple being able to kind of understand each other's emotions and where your partner is coming from. And that goes a little beyond negotiating around the facts or the details of it. And I don't know if your experience has been that, but that's what I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really different when you're negotiating for yourself versus you're negotiating for someone else, right? And when it's your job, right? Because
Mm.
I've heard people who negotiate for a living to negotiate for someone else, your boss, your company, your division, whatever that is, then that feels easier because you're not so much on the line. You have to do that. That's your job, right? So that's one thing. And another thing I think circles back to the opening of the show today, and that is that they'd like to get out of that painful spot as quickly as possible. And that sitting in the negotiation brings up a lot of pain. A lot of times, these people who negotiate a lot for a living are used to compartmentalizing, and they like to just like, let's just close that department and move on. And so that, trying to reach a resolution as quickly as possible is what they're looking to do.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's a good point. And it's a reminder that when people are engaged in the process of divorce, in some ways, so we're negotiating, lots of challenging things, custody, finances, things like that. But while we're negotiating that, I'm simultaneously dealing with my own internal distress about this and my own, it's the negotiation and how I'm managing how I feel. They're not totally independent entities. They're both kind of happening at the same time. So as you pointed out, sometimes the way that will play out is I want to get through this negotiation because I've gotta be done with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one last question, since we're close to the end of the show, which is that if a listener's on the fence about starting therapy after divorce or even during divorce, what would you want them to know about that process and about what's possible on the other side of that decision?
Yeah. I think that's a good question, Catherine. I think two things can be true at the same time about the decision. One is that some people don't necessarily want or need therapy. I think that's okay. As I mentioned before, I think there is a natural healing process. And whether or not you go to therapy, some of that healing can happen along the way and will happen along the way. But I also think the other thing that's true is that many people don't realize how helpful therapy can be in a moment like this. And that there is a kind of support and a kind of conversation and a kind of even benefits that they can get out of the process that are hard for them to see right now. So, for instance, I don't think any therapist could promise the specific benefits you get out of the process. But I think a good therapist could promise to have an honest and compassionate conversation, a conversation that would be actually hard to come by in your life outside of therapy because the other people in your life have different investments in your relationship, in your divorce, and in you, right? So an honest, compassionate conversation where we can talk about where you get stuck, where you're struggling. We can look at that from a broader perspective, a more human perspective, as we noted before, and there could be a lot of benefit just from being able to talk to someone in that way and see yourself in that light.
That's super helpful. Dr. Sean Condon, thank you so much for being my guest. For our listeners, Dr. Condon's contact information that he gave earlier in the show will be in the show notes. And I really am grateful for our conversation today. It was a lot of fun and I think really educational.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks again for having me. It was great.